The fork hit the floor before Lavinia Whitfield even finished asking, and the sound of it striking the dry pine boards echoed through the small ranch house like a gunshot. "We are not setting that table," said the older one, Eli, 13 years old and made entirely of locked jaw and rigid shoulders, his voice carrying the particular flatness of a child who had learned grief by being inside it too long. "We never set that table, not since Mama died, and you are not our Mama." Lavinia did not step back. She was standing in the middle of Isaac Covington's kitchen, with a stack of mismatched plates against her chest, and the last golden light of a September evening in 1878 pouring through the window behind her, and every instinct she had acquired over 26 years of surviving difficult men and harder circumstances told her that this moment was the one that would decide everything. Not just whether these two boys would accept her, whether she would allow herself to want them to. The younger one, Thomas, 9 years old, had not said a word. He was sitting in the corner near the iron stove with his knees pulled up and his eyes fixed on something invisible in the middle distance, and there was something in his silence that hurt worse than the fork on the floor. "Pick that up," Eli said, looking at his brother, and his voice had a strange quality, like a boy who had appointed himself the keeper of something enormous. Thomas did not move. "Pick it up yourself," Lavinia said, and her voice was steady. She set the plates on the table, not roughly, but deliberately, one at a time, the sound of each one a small declaration. "Or do not. But I am going to finish setting this table, and supper is going to be ready in 20 minutes, and you are both going to sit down at it. You cannot make us do anything," Eli said. "You are just here because Pa needed someone to cook." The word just hit its mark. She felt it. But she breathed through it and turned to lay out the forks she still had in her hand, and when she spoke again she chose her words carefully, the way a person crosses a frozen river, testing each step before trusting her weight to it. "You are right," she said. "I cannot make you do anything, and I am not trying to make you do anything. I am trying to make supper." She heard Eli pick up the fork she had dropped without being told to, and she did not turn around to acknowledge it, because she understood the dignity of a boy who needed to believe he had decided on his own. That was the night that mattered. That was the moment she would tell Isaac about later, much later, when the darkness outside was complete and the fire had burned down to coals and the boys were asleep and they were finally alone together. She would tell him that she had known in that kitchen that this was going to be the hardest thing she had ever done, and also, quietly, that she wanted to do it. But she had not known any of that 4 months earlier, when she had first read the advertisement in the Abilene Chronicle. It was May of 1878, and Lavinia Whitfield was living in a boarding house in Abilene, Kansas, paying her weekly rent by taking in mending from the wives of cattle merchants and doing occasional bookkeeping for a dry goods store on Buckeye Avenue. She had been in Abilene for 11 months. Before that she had been in St. Louis, and before St. Louis she had been in Louisville, Kentucky, where she had been born and raised, and where she had made the single decision that altered the entire course of her life. She had married badly at 21. His name was not worth printing here, because Lavinia herself had spent 2 years systematically removing it from her vocabulary, replacing it with the plain, unvarnished fact of what he had been. A charming man with a hidden motive, a man who had pursued her with a devotion that turned out to be a trap, because the devotion had been aimed not at her, but at the small inheritance her father had left her. When the money was gone, so was he, along with her standing in Louisville society and most of her confidence in her own judgment. She had been 23 when she left Kentucky. She had taken a train west because west was where a woman could start over without being watched, and she had rebuilt herself slowly, practically, learning the difference between sentiment and wisdom, and deciding that she would not confuse the two again. So when she read Isaac Covington's advertisement in the Chronicle, she read it the way she read everything now, with a clear eye and a guarded heart. It said, "Rancher, widower, 34, 2 sons ages 9 and 12, seeks capable woman for household position and possible companionship." Hard work guaranteed. Honesty required. Located 12 miles south of Abilene on the Covington spread Bluff Creek Road. References exchanged. It was the honesty required that caught her. Most advertisements for housekeepers said things like good Christian values desired or pleasant disposition preferred. The word honesty suggested someone who had been lied to. Lavinia understood that kind of requirement. She wrote back, stating her age, her skills, her history with household management, and the fact that she was a widow herself, which was not entirely accurate but was the simplest explanation for her circumstances that she had found. She did not mention Louisville. She mentioned her bookkeeping, her cooking, her willingness to work hard, and her expectation of fair treatment and fair pay. Isaac Covington wrote back within a week. His letter was brief and direct. It said he had 6 ranch hands who ate their noon meal in the bunkhouse and fended for themselves at supper, but that his house had been without proper management since his wife, Ruth, passed the previous spring, that his sons had gone wild in a quiet sort of way that worried him more than the loud kind would, and that he needed someone capable. He said the pay would be $12 a month plus room and board. He asked whether she could arrive by the 1st of June. She arrived on June the 3rd, 2 days late because the wagon she had arranged to hire had a broken axle outside of town, and she walked the last mile of Bluff Creek Road in the June heat with her 2 traveling cases, one in each hand, arriving at the Covington ranch gate with her boots dusty and her hair coming loose from its pins and her chin lifted because she had decided that whoever this man was, he was going to see her as she was, not as she wished she looked. Isaac Covington was standing at the fence rail when she came through the gate. She saw him before he saw her, because he was looking down at something in his hands, a length of fence wire he was working between his fingers, and she had a full 4 seconds to observe him before he looked up. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of weathered face that belonged to a man who spent most of his life outdoors. His hair was dark with threads of silver at the temples. He was wearing a worn work shirt and a battered hat with a sweat stain on the band, and he looked like the landscape, like something that had been shaped by the same forces that shaped the Kansas plains, direct and practical and permanent. He looked up and saw her standing at the gate with her 2 cases and her chin lifted, and whatever he had expected, it was not quite her. She could tell that from the brief stillness that came over his face. "Miss Whitfield," he said. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said automatically, and then could have kicked herself because she had decided to let the widow thing drift into the background rather than lead with it. "Mrs. Whitfield," he corrected himself without making anything of it. "I expected you yesterday." The wagon had a broken axle. He looked at her cases, then at the road behind her. "How far did you walk?" "A mile." He set down the fence wire and came to take one of her cases, and he did it without asking, which she found she appreciated. Men who asked permission to carry heavy things often were looking for gratitude. He just picked it up. "The house is this way," he said. The house was a solid 2-story structure, built from Kansas limestone in the lower half and wood in the upper, with a wide front porch and a kitchen garden on the south side that had been allowed to grow somewhat unruly. The inside was clean but bare of comfort. There were no curtains on most of the windows. The kitchen table had marks on it from careless handling. The parlor had a fine armchair with a braided rug beside it that someone had obviously loved, and next to it, pushed against the wall, was a child's stool that had not been moved in a long time. Isaac set her case down in the room he had prepared for her, a small room off the kitchen that had its own window and a decent bed and a washstand with a porcelain pitcher, and he told her the household schedule briefly and practically. Breakfast at 6, noon dinner was for the hands, but she was welcome to cook for herself and the boys, supper at 7. He did not ask her questions. She did not ask him questions. They understood each other with the efficiency of 2 people who had both learned that asking too much too soon was its own kind of betrayal. She did not meet the boys until supper. Thomas came into the kitchen first, silent as smoke, and stood near the door watching her with enormous brown eyes. He looked like his father around the jaw and forehead, but there was something softer in him, something not yet hardened by loss or by boyhood. "You must be Thomas," she said. "I am Lavinia." He looked at her a long time. "Eli says you are going to try to be our mother," he said. "Eli is mistaken," she said pleasantly, and went back to stirring the stew. Thomas considered this. Then he sat down at the table, not at a place setting, because there were no place settings, just the bare scarred wood, and he watched her cook with the focused attention of a child trying to figure out a puzzle. Eli came in last, just before Isaac, and stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, and his jaw set in the way she would come to know as his default expression of resistance. He was 12 then, not yet 13, and he was already tall, already showing the shape of the man he was going to be. But there was something raw and young just under the surface that he was working hard to keep covered. He looked at the food on the stove and at the woman cooking it, and then he said, "Pa, I'm not hungry." Isaac, who had just come through the door behind him, said, "Sit down, Eli." "I said I am not hungry, and I said sit down." There was a silence. Then Eli sat down, but not at the table. He sat in the chair nearest the door, the farthest point from the stove, and he picked up a piece of leather strap that was lying on the seat and began working at it with his thumbnail. Lavinia served the stew. She served it into 3 bowls and brought it to the table, setting one in front of Thomas and one at the place where Isaac always sat, which she had already identified by the slight wear pattern on the bench. She set the 3rd bowl at an empty place and said nothing about the fact that Eli was not at the table. They ate in silence. Lavinia ate standing at the counter, which she did for the first several weeks, not because anyone told her to, but because she did not yet know what it would mean to sit down at that table, and she was cautious about meanings. After supper, Isaac helped her wash up. He did not ask to help. He just picked up a dish towel and stood at the counter beside her, and they worked through the pile of dishes without speaking, and she was acutely aware of how close he was, how the small kitchen made closeness unavoidable, and how he smelled of cattle and clean sweat and something underneath that was warmer, almost like cedar. "He does not talk much at first," Isaac said, and she knew he meant Eli. "He talks fine," she said. "He said a dozen words before supper. He just does not want anything from me." Isaac was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No, he does not." She understood from the way he said it that he knew what that was like. The first month was hard in the way that anything is hard when you are an outsider in a household that has sealed itself against the world. The boys had developed, in the year since their mother died, a set of rituals and habits and silences that functioned as a kind of armor, and Lavinia moved through those rituals carefully, not trying to dismantle them, but simply existing alongside them, making herself useful without making herself intrusive. Ruth Covington had, by all the evidence Lavinia could gather, been a woman of particular grace and warmth. Her recipe book was still in the kitchen, written in a neat, slanted hand on the pages of a ledger, and Lavinia used it with care, never claiming the recipes as her own and always attributing them in her mind to the woman who had developed them. Ruth's curtains were still folded in a chest in the upstairs hallway, never rehung after some seasonal washing. Her small herb garden on the south side of the house was overgrown but alive, the rosemary still vigorous, the thyme spreading into the path. Lavinia started pulling the weeds from the herb garden in the 2nd week, a little each morning before breakfast, not dramatically, not as a gesture, just because it was useful work and because she liked the smell of rosemary in the morning heat. Thomas noticed first. He started appearing in the garden doorway while she worked, watching her, and one morning he came out and crouched near the rosemary and said, "Mama grew that." "I know," Lavinia said. "It is doing well." "She used to put it in the chicken," he said. "I know that too, I found her recipe." Thomas was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Do you know how to make it the way she did?" "I can try," Lavinia said. "I might not get it exactly right, but I can try." Thomas nodded and went back inside, and Lavinia stayed in the garden a little longer, her hands in the dirt, and she felt something shift in her chest that she was not entirely prepared for. She had come to this ranch to do a job. She had told herself that firmly and often. She had not come here to get attached to anything. Attachment was a trap she had fallen into once before, and she was not falling into it again. But Thomas was 9 years old and his mother was dead, and he wanted to know if she could make the chicken the right way. And there was no way to be human and not feel something about that. She did not let herself feel too much about Isaac. That was a separate and more dangerous territory. He was around, the way a man who runs a cattle ranch is always around without ever quite being still. She saw him at breakfast and supper, and occasionally through the kitchen window when he was working near the house. They spoke about practical things. He told her when the supply wagon was going into town and asked if she needed anything. She told him the roof above the pantry was leaking when it rained and he fixed it without comment. He showed her where the extra lamp oil was kept and how to manage the well pump when it's stuck in dry weather. He was kind. That was the word she kept coming back to. Not charming, not demonstrative, not trying to impress her in any visible way. Just kind, the way a person is kind when it is a fundamental part of their character rather than a performance. He thanked her for meals. He noticed when she had taken extra trouble with something and said so briefly, without flattery. He did not make demands and did not make her feel like a servant. She tried very hard not to find this attractive. She was aware, with a discipline she had built carefully over 3 years, that her judgment about men had been catastrophically wrong once before, and that the pleasantness of a man was not itself evidence of his trustworthiness. She knew that charming men could hide betrayal behind warmth. She knew that a man could seem like one thing and be another, but Isaac Covington was not charming. He was not trying to charm her. He was too worn down and too honest for charm. He was simply himself, consistently and without embellishment, and she found that more unsettling than charm would have been. July brought a heat wave that settled over the Kansas plains and did not leave for 3 weeks. The ranch house was stifling, and Lavinia moved supper preparations to the early morning and cooked everything cold or minimal in the afternoons. And she started leaving a pitcher of water with sliced lemon on the kitchen table, because it was the kind of small mercy the heat required. Isaac came in one afternoon, dust-covered from moving cattle, and drank 2 full glasses of the lemon water standing at the table, and then he looked at her with an expression she could not quite read, something between gratitude and something else, something more complicated. "Ruth used to do that," he said. "The lemon water." "I am sorry," she said, because she did not know what else to say. "I did not know." "I can change it." "No," he said, and his voice was quiet and firm. "Do not change it." That was the moment she first understood that grief for Isaac Covington was not a wound he was trying to close, but a set of carefully preserved things he was trying to keep. The lemon water, the recipe book, the curtains in the hallway chest. He was not stuck in the past. He functioned. He worked. He was present with his sons. But he was tending his grief the way a person tends something precious, and Lavinia respected that too much to treat it as an obstacle. Eli remained Eli. By the end of July, he would sometimes eat at the table if he came in after Thomas was already seated, which gave him the ability to tell himself he had sat down for Thomas's sake rather than for any other reason. He never spoke to Lavinia directly if he could help it. He spoke around her, to his father or to Thomas, and when he was alone in the kitchen with her he simply left, unless there was something on the stove he wanted, in which case he would get it with elaborate casualness, pretending she was not there. She understood that Eli was not being cruel. He was being a 13-year-old boy who had watched his mother die slowly over the space of 3 months, who had held the household together in his way during that time, who had decided at some point that the table was his mother's table, and that nobody was going to set it again, because setting it meant replacing her. She understood it because she had done something similar with her own grief, not over death but over betrayal. She had built her own elaborate system of not wanting, her own careful ritual of absence, and she recognized the shape of it in him. She did not try to dismantle his system. She worked around it, persistently and without confrontation, and she waited for the moment when he would decide on his own terms that he was ready for something to change. That moment came in the second week of September. It came because of a letter. Lavinia had written to her younger sister Clara in Louisville, one of the few letters she wrote back east, and Clara had written back with news that was good and news that was painful in equal measure. The good news was that Clara was expecting her first child. The painful news was that their mother, who had been unwell since the summer, had taken a turn for the worse and was not expected to recover before winter. Lavinia read the letter standing at the kitchen table, and she sat down rather suddenly, and she sat there for a long time after she had finished reading, the letter folded in her hands and her eyes fixed on the middle distance. And when Thomas came in to ask about supper, she said, "Give me a few minutes, sweetheart," which was the first time she had called him anything affectionate, and which she did not even notice until later. But Thomas noticed. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and then he came into the kitchen and stood next to her, not touching her, just standing close in the way a child stands near someone they are trying to comfort without quite knowing how. "Are you crying?" he asked. "Not yet," she said honestly. "Is it bad news?" "Mixed," she said. "My sister is going to have a baby, which is wonderful, and my mother is very sick." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the gravity of a 9-year-old who knows more about this particular subject than most adults, "When they get that sick, they usually do not get better." "No," Lavinia agreed. "They usually do not." He sat down next to her on the bench beside her, and he was silent for a little while, and then he said, "Is your mama nice?" "She is," Lavinia said. "She is very nice. She is the kind of person who always put an extra biscuit on your plate without being asked." Thomas thought about this. "She sounds like our mama," he said. "She does," Lavinia said, and she had to stop and breathe for a moment before she could continue. "She sounds a great deal like that." Isaac found them like that when he came in for supper, Lavinia and Thomas sitting side by side on the kitchen bench with the folded letter between them. And she saw his expression change when he read the situation, the quick intelligence in his eyes that she had come to appreciate, the way he understood things without having to have them explained. He did not ask her anything in front of the boys. He served his own supper that night, and then he stayed in the kitchen after the boys had gone up to bed, and she was washing dishes, and he said from behind her, "Bad news from home." She told him about her mother. She told him briefly and practically, without excess emotion, and he listened with the same quality of attention that he brought to everything, total and unhurried, and when she was done he said, "I am sorry. That is hard to be far from." "Yes," she said. "If you need to go, we can manage." She turned around to look at him. He was sitting at the table with his coffee cup, and his expression was straightforward and honest, no performance in it, just the offer. "I cannot afford the train fare," she said. "I can advance it." She shook her head. "I will not take money I have not earned." "You have earned 6 weeks of wages," he said. "I have not paid you yet because you have not asked." She stared at him. "You have not paid me yet because I forgot to ask," she said, which was true, because she had been absorbed in the work and the household and the boys and had simply not counted the days. He got up and went to the desk in the parlor, and he came back with the money, counted out carefully, and set it on the table in front of her. $62, which was $2 above what was owed, and she looked at it and looked at him. "That is $2 over," she said. "The lemon water," he said simply, and sat back down with his coffee. She did not go home to Louisville. A second letter came within the week saying her mother had passed more quickly than expected, quietly in her sleep, and the way that Clara wrote it was careful and tender, and Lavinia sat with it in her room that night and cried alone, as she preferred to do, because grief was private and she had no claim on this household's comfort. But in the morning when she came out to start breakfast, there was a small bunch of wildflowers on the kitchen table, the kind that grew along the creek, purple and yellow, gathered imprecisely in the way of a child who does not know how to make a bouquet but knows that flowers are the right gesture. She stood at the table looking at those flowers for a long moment before Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway, barefoot and still half asleep, watching her. "Do you like them?" he asked. "I love them," she said. He smiled, quick and brilliant like sunlight through a crack in a shutter, and then he looked serious again and said, "Eli helped me pick them. He knows which ones are the good ones." She looked at the flowers again. She thought about Eli, who had gone out in the early morning before she was up, helping his little brother gather wildflowers for a woman he had been refusing to speak to for 2.5 months. "Tell him thank you," she said. "Tell him yourself," Thomas said. "He is right outside." And she looked up, and Eli was indeed just outside the open kitchen door, standing on the porch with his hands in his pockets and his face carefully aimed at the middle distance, very specifically not looking in through the door. "Eli," she said. He turned his head a fraction. "Thank you for the flowers." There was a pause. Then, in a voice that was careful and small and trying very hard to sound like it did not matter at all, he said, "They were just sitting there by the creek." "They are beautiful," she said. He turned away and walked off the porch toward the barn, and she watched him go, and she felt the shift in her chest again, the one she kept trying to hold back, the one that told her she was losing the battle she had been fighting with herself since June. She had not come here to fall in love. She had not come here to build a family. She had come here to do a job and save some money and eventually move on to something more permanent, a teaching position perhaps, or another household in a larger town. She had a plan, and the plan was sensible and safe, and did not involve any cowboys with silver-threaded hair and kind eyes. But plans had a way of encountering the world and having to be renegotiated. September continued, and then the night with the fork happened, the night she had stood in the kitchen with the plates against her chest, and Eli had told her she was not their mother, and the fork had hit the floor. And after supper that night, after the boys were in bed and she was sitting alone in the kitchen with a cup of tea and the oil lamp turned low, Isaac came in. He sat down across from her at the table and he said, "Thomas told me what happened before supper." "It is all right," she said. "It is not," he said. "He should not speak to you that way." "He was not being cruel," she said. "He was being accurate. I am not their mother." Isaac looked at his hands for a moment. Then he said, "He has not been himself since Ruth died. Neither of them have." Eli took it harder because he was older. He understood more of what was happening. "I know," she said. "I see that. I should have told you before you came," he said, "about what the house has been like." "About the table." She looked at him. "What about the table?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Ruth set great store by supper," he said finally. "Not just the meal, the whole thing. Table set properly, everyone sitting together, that was important to her. She said it was the time of day when the family came back together from everything that had pulled them apart. She used to say that a set table was a promise that someone had thought ahead, that someone had made a place for you, that you were expected." Lavinia wrapped both hands around her teacup. "After she died," he said, "the boys stopped setting the table. I let it go. I did not have the heart to insist on it. We just ate from the pots or from bowls on the counter, nobody at the table at all at first. And then we started sitting down again, but without the setting, without the promise." She was very still. "Eli thinks that if someone sets the table properly again," Isaac said, "it means that Ruth has been replaced, and he will not allow that." "She cannot be replaced," Lavinia said. "No," he agreed. "She cannot." They sat in silence for a while. The lamp between them threw warm shadows across the table, and outside the September wind moved through the tall grass with a sound like water. "I did not mean to push it tonight," she said. "The table. I was not thinking about what it meant to them. I was just thinking about supper." "I know," he said, "but it needed to happen eventually. Eli cannot carry that particular piece of grief forever. He is 13 years old." She nodded. She turned her cup in her hands, and then she said, without quite having planned to, "What does it mean to you, the table?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was not going to answer. Then he said, "It means the same thing it meant to her, but I am afraid of it too." She looked up. "Not because of Ruth," he said. He met her eyes, and there was something in his expression that she had not seen before, something open and unguarded that he had been keeping carefully out of his face for the past 3 months. Because of what it would mean now, if someone said it again. The kitchen was very quiet. "Isaac," she said, and she heard in her own voice something she had not planned for. He stood up abruptly, not from anger, she could tell, but from the kind of controlled retreat a man makes when he has said more than he intended. "I am going to check on the horses," he said, which was the most obvious exit she had ever witnessed, and under different circumstances she might have smiled at it. "Of course," she said. He paused at the door. "Thank you for supper," he said, which was what he always said, but tonight it held more weight than usual, freighted with the things they had just said and not quite said. "Good night, Isaac," she said. He went out. She sat with her cooling tea and the oil lamp and the sound of the wind, and she permitted herself for exactly 5 minutes to feel what she had been not feeling for 3 months. And at the end of those 5 minutes, she put her cup in the washbowl and went to bed and lay in the dark for a long time, telling herself all the reasonable things about not confusing gratitude and proximity with anything more durable. She was not sure she believed herself. October came in cool and clear, with a sky so blue over the Kansas plains that it looked like something painted rather than real, and the ranch settled into the rhythms of autumn. There were cattle to move before the first frost, and Isaac was gone for stretches of 3 and 4 days at a time, out on the range with his hands, and the house became a different place in his absence, quieter in some ways, more itself in others. In his absence, Lavinia discovered that she and the boys had developed their own rhythms without quite noticing. Thomas came into the kitchen every morning to sit with her while she started breakfast, sometimes talking and sometimes just being there, comfortable in the silence the way children are when they feel safe. He had started helping her in the kitchen, learning to stir and to time things and to understand what a properly simmering pot looked like, and she taught him methodically and with genuine pleasure, because teaching was something she was good at, and because Thomas learned with a focused intensity that reminded her of herself. Eli was slower, but he was moving in his way. He had started coming to the kitchen table for supper without being asked, sitting across from Thomas with his book or his piece of leather work, and he did not set a place for himself, but he sat at the table, which was progress. He still did not speak much to Lavinia directly, but he had stopped speaking around her, which meant that occasionally, by accident, he would say something to Thomas that she overheard, and she understood from those overheard things that he was watching her carefully and thinking about what he saw. She overheard him tell Thomas, one afternoon when he thought she was in the pantry, that she was the best cook they had had since Mama, which he said in a tone of great reluctance, as if the admission had been extracted under duress. She was enormously, privately pleased. Isaac came back from the cattle drive on a Tuesday evening in mid-October, and he came back earlier than expected, which meant that supper was not quite ready, and she was at the kitchen counter with flour on her hands when he walked through the door, and they both stopped for a moment in the uncalculated intimacy of someone arriving home to someone who was there. "You are back early," she said. "Moved faster than expected," he said. He set his hat on the hook and ran a hand through his hair in the gesture she had come to recognize as his reset, the thing he did when he was transitioning from one mode of himself to another. "Something smells good. Apple cake," she said. "For Thomas's birthday on Thursday." He stopped. He looked at her with an expression she could not quite name. "You remembered his birthday." "I found it in Ruth's recipe book," she said. "She wrote the family birthdays on the inside cover. I thought I should note them." He sat down at the table heavily, not from exhaustion but from something else, and he put his elbows on the table and covered his face with his hands for a moment, and she went very still because she was not sure what he needed. Then he took his hands away and his face was composed, though she could see the effort it took. "She always made that cake for him," he said. "I know," Lavinia said quietly. "I found the recipe on the same page as his birthday. I thought about not making it if it would be too much, but then I thought about what it would mean to Thomas to have it on the day. I can make something else if you think it is wrong." He shook his head. "No," he said. "No, it is not wrong." He paused. "It is exactly right, actually. I just did not expect it." She turned back to the counter and went on with the cake, and behind her she heard him pour himself a glass of water and sit back in his chair, and the kitchen felt different with him in it, warmer and more settled, and she told herself firmly, and without much conviction, that it was only because it was better to cook with a fire going in the stove on a cool October evening. Thomas's birthday on Thursday was the first celebration the Covington ranch house had seen in a year and a half. Lavinia made the apple cake with the recipe from Ruth's book, and she made a proper supper of the roasted chicken with rosemary that Thomas had requested, and she set the table without comment or ceremony, and both boys came to it without incident, Eli pulling out his chair and sitting down as if it were something he had always done, as if there had never been a fork on the floor or a year of silences around the table. She did not make anything of it. She simply served the food and let Thomas open the small gift she had gotten him, a fine point pen and a bottle of ink that she had ordered from the supply store in Abilene, because she had noticed he was writing in his copybook with a nib that had been splitting for weeks. He held the pen very carefully and looked at her with those enormous brown eyes, and she had to look away before her composure became uncertain. After supper, when Thomas had gone to bed happy and full of cake, and Eli had lingered at the table longer than usual, and Isaac was helping her clear the dishes, Eli said from behind them, to no one in particular, in the careful voice of someone putting a foot on ice they are not sure will hold, "The cake tasted right." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Lavinia turned from the washbowl. Eli was looking at the table, not at her, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood. "I am glad," she said. He nodded once, still not looking at her. Then he got up and went to bed, his footsteps measured and deliberate on the stairs. Isaac was very still at the counter beside her. "That is the most he has said to you voluntarily since you arrived," he said. "I know," she said. "Lavinia," he said. She turned to look at him, which was a mistake, in the sense that being close to him in the warm kitchen light when he said her name in that particular tone was a situation her carefully maintained distance was not equipped for. He was looking at her with the direct, unguarded expression she had seen only once before, on the September night when he had talked about the table and then fled to check on the horses. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I am going to tell it badly because I am not good at this." "Take your time," she said. "I did not put that advertisement in the paper because I needed a housekeeper," he said. "I mean, I did. The house needed managing and the boys needed someone. But that was not the only reason." He stopped. He looked at his hands. "Ruth was sick for the last 3 months of her life, and in that time she talked to me about a great many things she needed to say before the end. One of the things she said was that she did not want me to be alone for the rest of my life. She made me promise I would not make the boys grow up in a house without a woman's presence. I resisted that. I told her no one could replace her. She said that was not the point. She said the boys needed someone to learn from, someone to show them what it looked like to be cared for properly." Lavinia was holding very still. "So the advertisement," he said, "was me trying to keep a promise I was not sure I believed in, and I expected someone practical and efficient and suited to the work. I did not expect—" He stopped again. "What did you not expect?" she said, and her voice was very quiet. "You," he said. "I did not expect you, specifically." She breathed in. The window above the sink had gone dark with evening, and the lamp on the table was very warm, and the kitchen smelled of apple cake and rosemary and wood smoke. "Isaac," she said, "I came here with a plan." "The plan did not include any of this." "I know," he said. "I married badly once before," she said. "I trusted someone who had a hidden motive, and I paid for it in ways I am still paying for. And I came west to build a life that did not depend on trusting my own judgment about men, because my judgment was clearly not reliable." She paused. "That is my dark past, as it were. I am not telling you to make you feel sorry for me. I am telling you because you should know that I am very careful and very slow, and that I have been trying very hard not to feel what I have been feeling in this kitchen for 4 months. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "How long do you need?" She looked at him. "I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight," he said. "I'm not making demands or setting conditions. I'm just asking how long you need before you can trust your judgment again." It was such an unexpectedly right thing to say that she had to take a moment before she could respond. "I do not know," she said honestly. "That is a fair answer," he said. He picked up the dish towel and went back to drying. "I can wait." "You are a very patient man," she said. "I am a very certain man," he said, which was different, and she understood the distinction. November in Kansas was cold and gray, and the first snow came on the 6th of the month. 2 inches of light dry powder that Thomas ran into with his arms wide, and his face turned up and his tongue out. Lavinia watched him from the kitchen window and felt something so complete and uncomplicated that she had to name it to herself honestly: happiness. She was happy in this house, on this ranch, in this kitchen, and the recognition of it was both wonderful and frightening, because she was aware that she had been happy before and had been wrong about what that meant. She had been writing to Clara more frequently, and Clara knew about Isaac, though Lavinia had been careful and measured in how she described the situation, because Clara was an enthusiast and Lavinia did not want enthusiasm applied to this particular situation before she was sure of herself. But in the November letter she wrote, "There is a man, and I think he is good, and I think I may trust him, and I am doing my best not to decide anything quickly." Clara wrote back, "Stop doing your best not to decide things quickly. Lavinia, you are 26 years old, and you are living in a house with a decent man and 2 boys who are already half yours. Stop being so careful that you miss what is right in front of you." She folded Clara's letter and put it in her pocket, and she thought about it for 3 days. On the 4th day she found Isaac in the barn, repairing a piece of harness leather in the weak November light that came through the barn door, and she stood at the door for a moment watching him work, the focused, unhurried way he did everything, and she said, "Isaac." He looked up. "I am done waiting," she said. He was very still. "I have thought about it carefully," she said, "and I have decided that you are trustworthy, and that I am not repeating a mistake, and that being afraid of something does not make it a bad idea." And I think she stopped, because this was the part that was hardest to say without her voice doing something unfortunate. "I think I am very much in love with you. I believe I have been for quite some time." Isaac set down the harness leather. He stood up from the stool he was on, and he crossed the barn to where she was standing in the doorway, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something bright and unguarded and so purely itself that it undid all the last careful architecture of her distance. He took her hands in both of his and he said, "I have been in love with you since you walked through that gate in June with your cases in both hands and your chin up and your hair coming down, and I have been trying to be patient about it ever since." He paused. "I am not a man who is easy to know, and the boys are a great deal of work, and this ranch is hard in ways it will not stop being hard. I know what I am offering is not simple." "I did not come west looking for simple," she said. He smiled, which was different from his usual expression, fuller and younger, and she realized she had been waiting to see him smile like that since June and not quite known it. He asked her to marry him the following Sunday formally, at the kitchen table with both boys present, because he said that what he was asking involved all of them and they should all be part of the asking. He had clearly told the boys something beforehand, because Thomas was visibly vibrating with suppressed excitement, and even Eli was sitting with a particular quality of attention that suggested he had opinions about what was happening. Isaac said, "I am asking Lavinia to be my wife. But I am also asking both of you, because she would be coming into this family, and that matters to all of us." Thomas said immediately, "Yes," with such completeness that Isaac raised an eyebrow, and Thomas said, "What? I have been hoping for this since September." Everyone looked at Eli. Eli looked at the table. He turned a fork over in his hands, and Lavinia registered the significance of that particular object in this particular moment. Then he looked up at her directly for perhaps the first time, and his expression was complicated and young and very honest. "You are not our mama," he said, which was what he had said before on the evening with the dropped fork, but it sounded different now. "But you are," he paused, and she could see him working through something, reaching for language that was bigger than he was used to carrying. "You are good," he said finally. "You are good to Thomas, and you are good to Pa, and you have been—" He stopped. He looked at the fork in his hands. "You put the rosemary in the chicken the right way," he said, and it came out more emotional than he had intended, and he looked suddenly mortified by himself and set the fork down very precisely. Lavinia said, "I had an excellent recipe." He looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that was close to relief. "Is that a yes?" Thomas demanded. "It is not a no," Eli said, which was the most 14-year-old thing Lavinia had ever heard, and she had to press her lips together very firmly. Isaac looked at her. "Lavinia." "Yes," she said. "It is absolutely yes." They were married in December of 1878 in Abilene at the Methodist Church on Buckeye Street, on a Tuesday when the sky was clear and cold as glass, and the plains stretched out in every direction under a thin coat of snow. The ceremony was brief and unceremonious, witnessed by the minister, his wife, two of Isaac's ranch hands, and both boys. Thomas stood next to Isaac, and Eli stood slightly apart with his arms folded, and his face arranged in the expression he used when he was feeling something strongly and preferred not to show it. Lavinia wore a blue dress she had made from fabric she had bought in Abilene, a plain blue wool with small buttons down the front that she had spent 3 evenings getting exactly right. She carried no flowers because it was December and the plains were bare, but Isaac had found somewhere a small spray of dried lavender tied with a ribbon, and he had pressed it into her hands that morning without comment, and she had held it through the whole ceremony, and was still holding it when they came out of the church into the cold, bright December air as Mr. and Mrs. Covington. Thomas grabbed her hand as they came down the church steps. He held it all the way to the wagon, talking about what they were going to have for supper and whether she was going to make the apple cake again for Christmas. And she kept hold of his hand and answered all his questions and felt, in a way she had not felt in a very long time, entirely present in her own life. Eli walked beside Isaac on the other side of the wagon and said nothing, but just before they reached the wagon he dropped back slightly and fell into step beside her, on the other side from Thomas, and he did not say anything and he did not take her hand, but he was there, walking beside her with his hands in his pockets and his chin up, and she understood what that meant. The winter was the quietest and warmest she had known in years. The ranch house was full of small accumulated changes that she had made since June. The curtains finally rehung from the hallway chest, Ruth's recipe book still on the kitchen shelf, but supplemented now by a new ledger where Lavinia was writing her own recipes alongside Ruth's. A new rag rug in the parlor that she had made from old clothes that had outgrown their usefulness. A set of mismatched cups on the kitchen shelf that she had collected from the mercantile on successive trips to town, because she liked the way they looked together. She wrote to Clara that she had found the thing she had not known she was looking for, and Clara wrote back with enormous enthusiasm, and the news that she had delivered a healthy son in December. And Lavinia read the letter by the fire with Isaac's hand on her shoulder and thought about the strangeness of roads and where they led when you were not watching. The table was set for every meal now. Neither boy had been explicitly told to do it, which was important to Lavinia, because she was aware that forced compliance was not the same as genuine acceptance, and what she wanted was genuine acceptance. What had happened instead was something more interesting and more lasting. She had told them why it mattered. It happened on an evening in late January, when a late-season blizzard had locked the ranch in for 2 days, and the 4 of them were spending the 3rd evening together in the kitchen with nowhere to go and nothing urgent to do except wait for the weather to pass. Isaac was mending a bridle at one end of the table, Thomas was copying sentences from a school book, Eli was reading, and Lavinia was finishing the hem of a shirt she was making for Thomas. At some point Thomas looked up from his copybook and asked, in the random way of children who are following a thought from some distance. Why does it matter whether we set the table or just eat from the pot? It was, she understood, the most innocent and most important question she had been asked in this house. She set down her sewing. She thought for a moment. Isaac had gone still at the other end of the table, his bridle in his hands, listening. Because setting the table is how you tell someone that you expected them to be there, she said. When you put a plate on the table and fold a napkin and lay out the silverware, you are saying, I knew you were coming. I made a place for you. You matter enough that I thought ahead. Thomas was looking at her with those eyes that took in everything. My mother used to do it every single meal, she said. Even when money was short and supper was just cornbread and nothing else. The table was always set properly, and I used to think it was just habit. But when I was older, I understood what she was doing. She was making a promise. She was saying, this family is real, you belong to it, you are expected here. The fire crackled. Outside, the blizzard moved past the windows with a low, steady sound. A lot of things in life go wrong, she said. People leave. Things end. But a set table every night is a way of saying that whatever else happens, this family holds. This table is here. This place is yours. Eli had lowered his book. He was looking at her. She met his eyes. Your mother understood that, she said very gently. That is why it mattered to her, and the table does not belong to any one person. It belongs to all of you, to everyone who sits at it. Setting it is not about forgetting her. It is the opposite. She paused. It is keeping the promise she started. The kitchen was very quiet. Thomas put down his pencil. He got up, and he went to the shelf where the plates were kept, and he began to set the table, even though supper was long finished and there was nothing to serve. Just the deliberate placing of plates and forks and the folded cloths that served as napkins, doing it carefully and completely, the way she had shown him. Lavinia watched him and did not say a word. Then Eli closed his book. He got up and stood next to Thomas and picked up 2 of the plates and placed them at the far end of the table with the focus of someone doing something ceremonial. He did not look at anyone. His jaw was set and his eyes were bright, and he was very clearly not going to cry and very clearly feeling something enormous. When the table was set, complete and unnecessary, set for no meal that was coming, just set because it needed to be, Thomas sat down at his place and looked at Lavinia. Like that, he said. Exactly like that, she said. Isaac reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand over and held on, and outside the blizzard moved through the Kansas winter dark, and inside the kitchen the lamp was warm and the table was set, and the Covington family was whole. Spring came in March with mud and green and the smell of the earth waking up, and with it, a new rhythm in the ranch house that felt different from the autumn one, lighter and more certain. The boys had school in town 3 days a week, and on those days, Lavinia rode in with them and did the supply shopping and the banking and whatever errands the ranch needed. And on the other days, she and Isaac worked the ranch together in the way of a couple who have learned to move through shared work as a single competent thing. She had a talent for the financial side of the operation that surprised Isaac, and then, once he stopped being surprised, pleased him. She found his ledgers in the spring and spent 3 days going through them, organizing his accounts and his supply contracts and his cattle records, and she came to him with a proposal about consolidating 2 of the summer cattle grazing agreements that she had worked out on paper, and he read it twice and looked at her with an expression that was part admiration and part something softer. You did not mention you could do this, he said. You asked about cooking and housekeeping, she said. You did not ask about the rest. He laughed, which was still enough of a novelty to make her feel absurdly good about herself, and he handed her the ledger and said, The accounts are yours. She managed the Covington Ranch accounts for the remainder of her life and was better at it than anyone else who had ever touched them. In May, almost a year to the day since she had first read the advertisement in the Abilene Chronicle, Lavinia discovered that she was expecting a child. She told Isaac on a Sunday morning when they were standing in the kitchen garden. the same garden where she had first begun to untangle herself from her carefully maintained distance, with the rosemary growing tall and fragrant in the warm spring air. He was very still for a moment. Then he looked at her with an expression so completely undefended that she felt it like a physical thing, open and enormous and entirely present. "Are you certain?" he said. "I am certain," she said. He took her face in both hands very carefully, the way a person holds something precious and irreplaceable, and he said, "Lavinia," and that was all, just her name. But in his voice it contained everything the year they had built together. The table set in the January blizzard, the apple cake on Thomas's birthday, the fork on the floor that September evening, the walk through the June heat with 2 traveling cases and her chin up and her hair coming down, all of it in one word. She put her hands over his and said, "I know." The boys had to be told, which was a different kind of conversation. Thomas, characteristically, was immediately and completely enthusiastic. He had views about names. He had views about the sleeping arrangements. He had views about whether the baby would be interested in learning to cook. He talked about it for 3 days without apparent pause. Eli was quieter. He was 14 by then, moving through that particular age with the characteristic intensity of a boy who feels everything enormously, and has decided that showing it is inadvisable. He was silent about the news for a full day, and then he found Lavinia alone in the kitchen, and he stood in the doorway and said, without preamble, "Is this why you married Pa? Because you wanted children?" She set down what she was doing and turned to face him because he deserved her full attention. "No," she said. "I married your father because I love him. This is separate. This is something that came from that." She paused. "And I need you to know something, Eli. I have not been trying to build a replacement family. I have been trying to be part of the one that already exists. There is a difference." He was looking at his boots. "Your mother built something real," she said. "She built this house and this table, and she raised 2 boys who are worth knowing. I'm not replacing any of that. I am adding to it. And the baby that is coming will be part of everything your mother built because her influence is in every wall of this house." Eli was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, with the careful precision of someone working out something important, "So it will still be our family, just bigger." "Just bigger," she agreed. He nodded. He went back to whatever he had been doing, and she heard him telling Thomas, later that afternoon, that the baby was going to need someone to teach it things, and that he was going to be the one to teach it anything to do with horses, which Thomas immediately disputed, and she listened to them argue about it from the kitchen with something that could only honestly be described as joy. The summer of 1879 was warm and full, and Lavinia Covington, née Whitfield, who had come west from Louisville with a broken marriage and a careful heart and 2 traveling cases, and no idea what she was walking toward, found herself in the middle of a life she had not planned and could not now imagine having missed. She continued teaching Thomas to cook, who was turning into a genuinely skilled kitchen hand with a natural instinct for flavor and timing. She had long conversations with Eli about books, which had become their primary mode of connection, exchanging observations about what they were reading with the shared seriousness of 2 people who both lived partly inside their own heads and appreciated someone who understood that. She rode out with Isaac on the weekends when the pregnancy allowed and watched the ranch with the eyes of a woman who had come to understand its particulars, the patterns of the pasture and the cattle, and the way the light fell across Bluff Creek at the end of a long working day. She wrote to Clara every 2 weeks and received Clara's letters with the particular pleasure of 2 sisters who had grown up close and gone different directions, and discovered that distance made the closeness more conscious. Clara's son was growing well. Clara's husband was steady and kind. Clara was building something in Louisville that looked like the same thing Lavinia was building in Kansas, a life based on the ordinary and permanent pleasures of being somewhere that was truly yours. The baby came on a November morning, 1879, with a first light sky over the plains and a hard frost on the kitchen garden. Isaac had ridden for the doctor the night before when it became clear things were moving, and the doctor arrived barely in time, and it was fast and it was hard, and it was finished by the time the sun was fully up. And the child that came into the world on that November morning was a boy, healthy and loud, and possessed from the first moment of a furious and emphatic personality that made Lavinia think he was going to be a handful, and feel enormously fond of him for exactly that reason. They named him Samuel. Samuel James Covington, after Isaac's father and after no one in particular on Lavinia's side, though she chose the middle name because she had always liked it and there was no one left alive in Louisville to have opinions about it. Thomas was allowed in first, and he stood at the bedside looking at the baby with wide, serious eyes, and then he looked at Lavinia and said, "He is very red." "They all are at first," she said. "He is also very loud," Thomas said. "He takes after his mother," Isaac said from the doorway, and Lavinia gave him a look that he received with complete equanimity. Eli came in last. He stood at the bedside looking at the baby with an expression that was very carefully not the expression of a 14-year-old boy who was moved beyond his ability to act otherwise. He looked at Samuel for a long time. Samuel, who was briefly quiet, looked back at him with the unfocused attention of a newborn who is trying to figure out where he is. Then Eli said, "He has Pa's chin." "He does," Lavinia said. "He is going to need people to show him things," Eli said, which was exactly what he had said to Thomas about this in the summer, and which had the same weight now as it had then. "He is going to need all of you," Lavinia said. Eli nodded. And then, with a deliberateness that she recognized as the Covington family mode of expressing things too large for ordinary speech, he reached down and adjusted the blanket around Samuel's shoulder very precisely, and then he straightened up and said, in the voice of someone making a decision, "We will take care of him." The "we" was not lost on anyone. The table that evening, which Lavinia had not seen, had been set by both boys without being asked, set for 5 even though she was still in bed, and the baby was in the cradle Isaac had moved from the attic, set with the extra care of a special occasion, the good cloths instead of the everyday ones, the cups that she had collected from the mercantile arranged in the specific way she liked them, everything in its place the way a promise looks when it is kept. Isaac told her about it that evening when he came to sit with her, and she held Samuel against her shoulder and listened. And she thought about the advertisement in the Abilene Chronicle that she had read in May of 1878 with a clear eye and a guarded heart, honesty required, and about the man who had written it, who had been trying to keep a promise he was not sure he believed in, and about the boys who had sealed themselves against the world and then, slowly, one chose gesture at a time, opened a door. She thought about the fork on the floor and the wildflowers by the creek and the apple cake that tasted right and the January blizzard, and the table set for no meal, just because it needed to be, just because the promise had been understood. She thought about the herb garden where the rosemary grew, and the recipe book with the birthdays written on the inside cover, and the woman she had never met who had understood that a set table was a place made for someone, a declaration that you were expected, that you belonged, that this family was real and you were part of it. She thought about her own mother who had put an extra biscuit on your plate without being asked, and she held Samuel and breathed in the smell of him and thought, This is what that was. The years that followed were good years, the way the best years are good, not without difficulty or weather or the ordinary hard work of keeping a ranch and a family alive and moving forward, but good at the center of them, solid and true. Eli grew into the man his father had been raising, straight and steady and deeply competent, and he took over the management of the cattle side of the operation at 17, with a capability that made Isaac quietly proud in the way he was always quietly proud, which meant he said very little about it, and showed it instead in the way he deferred to Eli on grazing decisions, and let him make choices and trusted those choices. Eli and Lavinia developed, over the years, a friendship that was its own thing, distinct from anything else in the household. They read the same books and argued about them with mutual enjoyment. He asked her advice about the ranch accounts when he disagreed with something, not because he expected her to override Isaac, but because she was the most clear-headed analyst he knew, and he respected that. When he was 19, he brought home a girl from town named Adeline Harper, the schoolteacher's daughter, with brown eyes and a forthright manner that reminded Lavinia unexpectedly of herself at that age. And Lavinia liked her immediately and thoroughly. And Adeline, who was sharp about people, saw exactly how things worked in the Covington house and stepped into the life of it with easy warmth. Eli married Adeline in the spring of 1883, and the wedding supper was at the ranch house, with a table that seated 14 people and was set with everything Lavinia could find in the way of linens and silverware and the good cups from the shelf. And the table looked like exactly what it was. A promise made good on, a place prepared, a declaration that everyone seated at it was expected and welcome and accounted for. Thomas, at 16, was a different kind of person from his brother, more open, more given to expansiveness and enthusiasm, already showing the contours of someone who was going to be both practical and imaginative, who was going to find the crossroads between those two things and live there happily. His cooking had become, by his mid-teens, genuinely excellent, and Lavinia had the quiet satisfaction of watching him cook for guests at the ranch with a confidence and precision that belonged entirely to himself, built on what she had shown him, but long since his own. Samuel grew up loud and determined, and deeply attached to all four of the people who were raising him. He called Isaac Pa, and he called Lavinia Mama from the time he could form words, and he called Eli and Thomas by name until he was 4 years old. And then one day he started calling Thomas Tom and Eli E, and nobody corrected him, because it seemed to please him and neither brother minded in the slightest. Samuel also, to the enormous satisfaction of everyone who had watched the table situation in 1878, began setting the table on his own initiative at the age of 5, with great seriousness and several errors of placement that nobody corrected, because the gesture was what mattered, and he had understood from growing up inside the Covington family what the gesture meant. A second pregnancy came in 1882, and this one gave them a daughter, small and dark-haired and very watchful, whom they named Ruth Clara Covington, the first name for the woman who had set the table before anyone else had thought to, and the second for the sister in Louisville who had told Lavinia to stop being so careful that she missed what was right in front of her. Ruth Clara was called Ruthie by everyone except Eli, who called her by her full name from the beginning with the seriousness of an older brother who had decided she was to be treated as a complete person, and Isaac, who called her Little Bird for reasons he never fully explained, and that Ruthie accepted as her due. The ranch grew through the 1880s, expanded slowly and carefully under the management of Isaac and Lavinia working together, the cattle side under Eli's capable hands and the financial side under Lavinia's, and they hired a second hand and then a third and built a second bunkhouse, and eventually expanded the house itself, adding a room on the east side for Ruthie and enlarging the kitchen, because the kitchen had always been the heart of the house, and it had earned the space. The kitchen table was replaced once, in 1885, with a new pine table that Lavinia had ordered from a carpenter in Abilene, built wide enough to seat 8 without crowding. On the day the new table arrived, Isaac looked at it for a long time before he spoke, and then he said, "Ruth would have liked this." "I thought about that before I ordered it," Lavinia said. He put his arm around her shoulder, there in the kitchen with the new table in the center of it, and she leaned into him, and they stood like that for a while in the easy comfort of two people who have spent enough years together to know how to be still in the same space. The new table was set for supper that evening, and it was Ruthie who set it, at age 3.5, with Samuel supervising and Thomas correcting and Eli standing in the doorway watching with his arms folded, and the slight smile he had developed over the years that meant he was more pleased than he intended to show. The placement was imperfect and enthusiastic, and took a great deal longer than it needed to, and it was the best thing Lavinia had seen in a long time. She thought about the advertisement again on evenings like that. She thought about herself, reading it at the boarding house table in Abilene, with her clear eye and her guarded heart, telling herself she was going to be practical and safe, and was absolutely not going to fall in love with anyone. She thought about the mile walk down Bluff Creek Road in the June heat, and the man looking down at the fence wire in his hands, and the two boys who had sealed themselves into their grief like a fortress. She thought about the fork on the floor, and the words "I am not your mama," which were true, and which she had never tried to make untrue, and which had turned out not to be the obstacle she had thought they were on that September evening, because they had led her, eventually, to the conversation at the table in the January blizzard, and to the understanding that the table was not about replacing anyone but about keeping a promise, and to the moment when two boys had said it for no meal. Just because they understood what it meant. What it meant was, you are expected, you belong here, this family is real, and she was real. Lavinia Whitfield Covington, who had come west with a broken heart and a sensible plan, and had found something she had not known how to look for, was absolutely and entirely real in her life. She was the woman who made the rosemary chicken, and managed the ranch accounts and taught Thomas to cook, and argued about books with Eli, and held Ruthie while she slept and read stories to Samuel by lamplight, and lay in the dark next to Isaac Covington, while the Kansas wind moved through the tall grass outside the window, listening to him breathe. She was the woman who had set the table on a September evening in 1878 and let a fork hit the floor and said, quietly and without drama, "I am going to finish setting this table," and meant it about far more than the table. In the spring of 1887, 9 years after Lavinia had first walked through the gate of the Covington ranch, she sat at the wide pine kitchen table on a Sunday morning with a cup of coffee and a letter from Clara, and the sound of the whole household moving through its Sunday rhythm around her. Isaac was on the porch with his coffee, and the sound of him rocking in the chair was steady and comfortable as a heartbeat. Samuel and Ruthie were somewhere outside, their voices reaching her through the open kitchen window in bursts of argument and laughter. Eli and Adeline were coming for Sunday dinner, which Thomas was already preparing with the focused absorption of someone who had long since made the kitchen his own in a way that coexisted happily with Lavinia's ownership of it. She read Clara's letter, which was full of ordinary news, her son's progress at school and her husband's new business venture and the Louisville Spring, and she wrote back on the stationery she kept in the kitchen drawer, the good kind, ivory with a small printed border. She wrote, "The ranch is well. The children are well. Isaac is well." This morning Ruthie set the table for Sunday dinner all by herself, every piece in exactly the right place, and stood back to look at it with an expression of such complete satisfaction that I thought my heart was going to stop. She is 4 years old, and she already understands that a set table is a promise. I think about our mother when I see that. I think she would have been very pleased. She folded the letter. She looked at the table, at the good cloths Ruthie had put down, at the cups lined up in the way she liked them, at the places made for people who were expected and belonged and would come through the door at noon and find everything ready for them. A set table was a promise. Someone had made a place for her, too, she thought. The advertisement in the Abilene Chronicle, brief and direct, honesty required. The room off the kitchen with its washstand and its window. The money counted out and the $2 extra for the lemon water. The wildflowers by the creek in the early morning. The question asked at the kitchen table with both boys present, because what he was asking involved all of them. Someone had thought ahead. Someone had made a place for her. She was expected here. She belonged here. This family was real. Isaac came in from the porch, pausing in the kitchen doorway the way he sometimes did, just standing for a moment looking at her at the table with the morning light through the window, and she looked up at him and he looked at her. And in that brief ordinary exchange was 9 years of everything. The fork on the floor and the January blizzard and the apple cake, and the lemon water and the Samuel in his arms, and the Ruthie setting the table with her whole heart. All of it. Present and permanent and entirely theirs. Ready for Sunday, he said. Always, she said, and meant it without qualification. Meant it about Sunday and about everything. About the ranch and the family and the long, beautiful, difficult road of a life built with care and honesty, and the willingness to trust what was good. He came across the kitchen and kissed her forehead in the way he had started doing years ago, unhurried and certain, the way he did most things. And then he poured himself more coffee and sat down across from her at the table that his daughter had set, and the kitchen filled with the smell of Thomas's cooking and the sound of children outside, and the steady warm light of a spring morning in Kansas. And Lavinia Whitfield Covington sat at the center of all of it and held her coffee cup in both hands and was, in the absolute and undeniable and thoroughly earned sense of the word, home.